Hello, hello. All right, we're live. Let's get this shared out to folks. Do, 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 do. You are the jewel, royal diadem. What? Publish now. All right, and we are officially live and everything's shared, and here I am. I hope everybody's doing well today on this Saturday. It's kind of nice and cool here in Virginia today, but quite comfortable. I was out earlier doing some wandering and exploring the city, looking for some more forageables and seeing what it was that I could find here and what Falls Church has to offer. I'm always surprised when I go out. I found everything from fairy gardens to people with trolls out in their yard, guarding over the woodlands. It's been kind of fun to get out and wander. And it's something that I think that everyone should do, regardless of where you live, is just to take some time to walk. That the more time we spend out there walking and wandering around, the more that we can see. And it brings the spaces we're in to a human scale. All right. And actually, let me get this link and share it with the community Discord so that they can join us if they like. Maybe have a bit of a chat over there. I know there's some folks who reached out and said they weren't going to be able to join us this week because of some other plans, but I'm here having a good time. Glad to join you. When it comes to the show proper, officially, we are now on sabbatical for the next couple of weeks, at a bare minimum, possibly a couple of months, having some time to take a look at what's going on and how to proceed. Part of that, as I work through this, is to put together a list of who I want to go visit and hang out with and record some in-person conversations with here in the months ahead once we kind of get past this COVID period. There are a lot of really cool people doing some interesting work in the Virginia area. Of course, I've already visited Radical Roots over near Kieseltown, Virginia. Dave and Lee O'Neill. I was over at Island Creek Farm for a while ago and visited with Holly Brown, who's there, and just looking for who are some interesting people with interesting projects. There's, of course, Chris Newman of Sylvan Aqua Farm, who's just, I absolutely love his work and what he's writing about and who he's working with to get agriculture into the hands of more people, especially those who wouldn't traditionally have access to land or other like farming resources, as they're growing in ways that are not related to commodity crops and are leasing and doing what they can to get land to folks so that they can learn to farm and work it. There is the Virginia Free Farm, which is a little over, I think it's hour and a half from where I am right now. I'd like to go over and visit and sit down with the proprietor there and see what they have to say about their experiences as a veteran getting engaged in farming. One of my good friends is a big fan of a lot of the soft skills that come with farming because of being a veteran and coming back from combat and needing to be able to do something different other than, all of those skills that they had as someone who was engaged in the infantry, that farming provides them with another outlet now that they're back into civilian life. And I think that that's an interesting space to explore. And my friend in particular looks at, like, the Romans used settling practices. Um, Do you know when you're gonna get out there and get to visit that Erie Canal Aqueduct project? Um, but yeah, I just think about all the ways that we can use gardening and farming and these activities of permaculture to really help people work through a lot of our experiences, abuse and trauma and things like that. Knowing how much like the natural environment has worked a lot for me, and I know that there are some programs that are related to that for connecting people with gardens and gardening as a way to heal and recover. And I'm interested in seeing more of those programs and getting to visit with some folks and talk about what was their inspiration for it. Did it come from a personal place of healing, or was it something that, someone else introduced them to, or were they just someone who thought that it would be an interesting way to reach out and work with folks? But from there, I'd really like to sit down and interview with the Second Lady of Pennsylvania. I think that the work that she's doing with their free store in Western Pennsylvania, Braddock, is an interesting model that we could use to connect people to things that would normally be thrown away. Having done some dumpster diving myself over the years to find resources and products, that's something that, you know, um, I think is an easy way for us to engage in reducing waste and caring for people while also caring for the earth, because we're keeping, so many products that might not work on the grocery shelves out of the waste stream. You're trying to make it a family day with the wife, a 19-month-old, and a dog. uh, I remember many, many days with my children in a carrier or a jogging stroller as we would wander around a variety of parks and other green spaces when my children were very young. Particularly, my children were only 16 months apart. So not only did I have a 19-month-old, I also had a 3-month-old, usually one in one arm, and then a stroller or a carrier for the other. And it's always such an experience. But I do have to say though that like as the kids get older, that's a lot of fun too, because you can have them and be teaching them about how to forage or how to, find food in those spaces. It's one of my favorite things to do with my son is take him and like we'll wander. There are some places we know that have wild brambles. And so when those are in season, go and, walk away with our fingers and faces all red from all the berry juices and having that time and experience to eat and enjoy when we're out there. Though, of course, now my son is the youngest of my children at the moment and is 11 years old and 5'8", and it takes a lot more berries these days than it did when I was first teaching about those things to sate him from the experience. Oh, but I enjoy that time and space that we have with kids to have them out there and wander around with them. I think it was my daughter was probably 14 or 15 months old. I don't know. When do we stop counting the ages of children in months? Is that at 2 or 3? But taking her out, and the first things that she learned to forage were violets, and having her there, and as we would be pulling violets and eating those fresh out of the yard, talking about what sounds the bees make. Um, and she'd hold her violet as if it was the bee and the wings of the bee and sit there and flap the violet and be like, bzzz. And yeah, just the connection that we have with our children and with natural spaces by taking them out there and having those kinds of moments. Um, and then, of course, as they get older, teaching them all the skills that go with it, how not only what they can harvest, but what are the tools that they could make. Sitting down with my son, once I had planted a willow copse, he and I would go out and cut some of those branches in order to make berry hooks. So that then when we were out there grabbing brambles and things, being able to reach out into the woods and pull those materials closer to us so that we could get to them more easily, or reaching up into the trees in order to pull down some of the sumac and get those large flower clusters that you can soak in water and make kind of like a bright lemonade with. It's also fun because he and I made a digging stick for each of us, and he had one that was his size and his scale, and one for me. And for probably 2 years, that's what we would use to dig and harvest and divide bulbs, get to our garlic and things like that, and just being able to move away from all of these like normal things that so often I think that we feel that we need to buy. But if you just have a good hatchet or tomahawk or decent sized knife, that you can make so many tools. And it's a conversation that I've had with my wife just recently as we're planning for some new directions. That idea of skills over stuff, and how much can we do with just a couple of high quality tools and the skills to go with them. And leaning into, there's this idea of like the primitive skills movement. And I don't think that that's a fair term to use because of how useful and functional many of those skills are within society now. I think about when I learned lacing and how many times I've used lacing in order to fix, modern materials within civilization, going through and having a recycling bin that's been broken because of people pick it up, they dump it, they throw it to the curb, and rather than needing to get a new one, I found that drilling some holes in the side and running string through made something that was so much more durable than what we'd ever had. And very often those half broken items that I use these different skills to repair wound up lasting longer than their original unbroken form. I think the one recycling bin was broken within like a year, and after I laced it is now, oh, it's probably 8 or 9 years since I made that repair, that it's still in great shape and useful. And just, yeah, the way that all that ties together. Well, and I think my problem, Jason, with what you're saying, like about language, is that like there are those hallmarks of civilization, but I don't see them as actually having the right connotation. That there's this idea of what is civilized and what is not. I'm like, but why is it that just because we build cities that it at least well, that is good. And I guess it's just that it's that modern usage of primitive and being a negative. So yeah, and those are some more conversations I'm sure that we could get into, is usage. And that's one of the pieces that I get into when it comes to permaculture as a practice, is that there are a lot of spaces where we've created this jargon that I think disconnects permaculture practices from many of the sciences and other ideas that they pull from, that would be incredibly functional if we were using the same language. And that's why a while back, I think it was you, Jason, and Doug that responded that you'd be interested in doing like an ecology for permaculture practitioners. And it's something that I still lean into, that I think that I'd like to do during this break, is like a 4-hour course on the places where permaculture language diverges from the practices of ecology, and how we can use the ideas of sinks and sources and many of these other pieces of terminology to better describe like zone models and things like that, and have the language of ecology to apply to our cities. When we look at these novel ecosystems that are emerging, that, how can we take those spaces and understand the ways in which they're still incredibly functional? And as people who are interested in doing resource restoration, environmental restoration, how can we pull on these ideas in order to be able to better partner with people who are doing this kind of work? Um, and yeah, it's just like it's these little tweaks in the way that we talk, or the way that we tell stories or imagine the future, that are the spaces where I think not only as permaculture practitioners, but anybody who wants to tackle climate change and these other pieces can have a really big impact. And it's where, like, I love the idea of the Green New Deal until I read what's actually in it, because it comes across less as a really big green push and more as just a jobs bill. And though I see the need for something like that, you know, given my own traditions and politics, I just wish that it went further. Um, but it's realizing how like non-mainstream and radical many of our views as permaculture practitioners are. Like even having conversations with, I'm an unabashed leftist, having conversations with my friends who are more conservative on the political spectrum, the ways in which they would really like to see something that is hugely different from where we are right now and what that would look like. And how, like, even if it is going back to the land and homesteading because you have the privilege and the resources to do so, or your folks who are in a city who are working without land, the way all of that kind of comes together and we have these common spaces. And it just makes me think that, it's this piece that I keep returning to is that what divides us is so much smaller than what would bring us together. And it's that there's so much focus on that divide and driving a wedge that if we just talk about the actual issues and things that we care about, then we can bring more people to the table, that we could be growing more food by having conversations about, you want a beautiful front yard. Let's make that more functional. Let's put more food in that space. Um, I feel sometimes like any step that we take in the right direction is a step too far for so many folks. And yeah, like how do we change that? How do we push those edges even further? There's been, I think it was a conversation with David Holmgren. He talked about the need for us just to kind of move away from it. That it's not about bringing in those people who are outside of our sphere of influence, but it's finding those people who are on the fence, finding those fence sitters, drawing them in. If we have to, kind of dragging them in and showing them what beauty is there, what is possible once we start applying these ideas of design and getting people engaged and just involved, and how like we can enrich people's lives and change what it is that they're doing. Well, and like that view of what a good future looks like, there's a lot I think of when it comes to like utopian literature and describing a beautiful future. But why is it that a good future is right now in our political discourse is still like this idea of a 1950s nuclear family, except it's, both people working, 2 cars, using all of these resources rather than talking about how, we can have a non-growth economy that is still beautiful, that involves leisure. I was engaged in a conversation earlier on Twitter. Please forgive me. I love arguing and discussing with people on Twitter, but about how like there's this fight about increasing the minimum wage to $14, but or $15, but if we had kept minimum wage tagged to productivity, it would be at least $24 an hour. And I think about all these people who are trying to do something different, which is one of the arguments that I think really reinforces UBI, is that you wouldn't have to come from wealth or privilege in order to take a dare and to try something. But that if we like have a good basic wage for people who are around us, that would allow people to take care of themselves. And that because in a service-based economy, it's about the ability to render services and help people. Um, Let me get your chats here real quick. Well, yeah, that language of primitive and civilized, I still think about our ability to transform cities so that once we're done with them, they are something radically different from what they are. So kind of an eco-futurism rather than an eco-monasticism. Which reminds me, Jason, I've been thinking some about our conversations about storytelling and some of the stuff that you've been doing with the Fifth World. I want to catch you offline. Maybe if we can catch up a bit this evening, um, before 7. I'd like to maybe propose an idea to you about being able to have some of those conversations and making them public, but we can get into those a bit more. I can't say, Benny, that I'm familiar with Michael Dowd, but I would certainly like to look into him. Let me write that in my notes here for follow-up. Um, I'm there's a fellow, let me look him up real quick. There's somebody whose work I have. I don't think I have his book in hand, but it's you. Okay. I'll have to look that up. I'm thinking of um there's a fellow who works in spiritualism and I'm thinking of Chad Myers. Um he's the only person I could think of who I'd think of as an eco-theist. He's done quite a lot of work on like farming and permaculture and theology. Wrote a really good book on the need for here, let me write this. It's Chad. If I remember right, Chad's in California. Um, he's a permaculture practitioner who's also, yeah, done a lot of writing in the like eco-theist space. He's a Christian, really big believer in the sabbatical. Or not the sabbatical. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of what I'm currently working on. No, he's done a lot of writing and work in the space of Jubilee and debt forgiveness and gleaning, and our ability to have like access to resources and debt relief and how those are really big Christian values. Yeah, Jubilee. Um, I'll have if I think about it, I'll see if I can pull his books that I have here and maybe do a bit of reading and writing for those on the next um for the next live stream. But yeah, Ched Meyer's work is really, really interesting. Some of the stuff that he's written, it's not super long. It's a little deep theologically, so it took me a bit to get involved, like to get into and read. But I really like his work, and it hones pretty closely to my background and experiences growing up in a historic Peace Church. Um, if you're familiar with the Amish and Mennonites, I grew up in an Anabaptist tradition that is related to those traditions, and like the Quakers and some of the others, were really oriented towards peace and caring for your fellow man. And those are some of the ideas that I realized kind of radicalized me as a youth because we were talking about human liberation and moving from oppression. And even though I kind of stepped away from faith and those practices, understanding that many of those ideas underpinned my perspective and views of anarchism later. And it's only been in the last 2 or 3 years looking at Ched's work and like prison abolition, abolishing the death penalty, and many of the other ideas that are related to that, that I've kind of come back to these ideas and understand how powerful they are and how meaningful those kinds of traditions are. But I was wondering, Benny, could you share a bit more about Michael Dowd and Joe Brewer and like the kinds of things that they're working on? Is it I'm reading that you read so far about the idea that civilization is inevitably suicidal. Um, I'll get to that in a second. That's a good one too. Um, but that idea of like if civilization is inevitably suicidal, it's anthropocentric. I think of David Abrams' work and about those discussions of the whole and how a lot of these ideas really I think that if we were talking from an animist perspective, even if it was not necessarily touching on the spiritual pieces of it, but the relationships that come from that would help kind of deconstruct some of the modern like duality between our like mind and the world around us. And like, if we can get out of that kind of a mindset and move away or move into something that is non-dualistic, the things that those ideas just dismantle by moving into that headspace. Yeah. My recollection is that jubilees were every 7 years, which is also where like the tradition of sabbaticals and other things come in. Is that it's that idea that for every 6 years, um, 6 years of labor, you should have a year of rest. And that I believe jubilees were every 7 years for relief of certain debts. And I think there were some that might have been 40 that were like community relief of debts. But yeah, I'll look into that and see if I can include that in one of these future conversations, because it'd be fascinating to be able to discuss and explore with you further. I have a bunch of material on it, but it's not something that I've necessarily brought together cohesively. Um, awesome. Awesome. I will watch some of that too. The great story. Awesome. Um, yeah, the other thing that I liked about like David Graeber's work, there was a podcast on like the theory of money that I ran across. Um, yeah, and I think that like that 7 year cycle that related to a lot of these ideas, but I'll look into it a bit further and see what I can dig up. Um, but like when it comes to our theory of money and things like that, is that there's the way that an economist views money, and then there's the way that like an anthropologist or somebody who's engaged in the social side of things looks at money. And that's where like reading Graeber's book was fascinating for me, because there's a piece that stood out that I was speaking with someone with earlier this week, is that like barter only exists in communities in which there is some form of monetary practice. That communities that don't have a sense of money or monetary value, bless you, like don't engage in barter, because with barter we're still um oh, okay. Hmm. Yeah, I'll have to do some more reading on that. Yeah, I'm a little saddened by the passing of Graeber, because he was somebody who was on my list to try and interview, and then saw that that he passed away in 2020. Just another blow that was landed upon us, regretfully. Oh, having lived through Y2K and been on an IT team that had a lot of work to get us through that, yeah, I, I was surprised that we made it through as easily as we did. Thank you, Jason. I'm going to write that down to read later and see if I can tie it all together. Because I'm thinking, let me see. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's if we can mobilize like that, or for the moonshot, or all of these other big projects, it's still, why is climate change such a hard thing? I mean, really asking that question that was rhetorical, because there are so many forces that are engaged with it. Um, but radical anthropology. You guys are giving me all kinds of great resources today to look into and share. All right. Now that I've written all these down and I'm a bit off track, any questions or anything on where we should go next or what to lead into as I sit here and have rambled for about a half an hour now? Okay. Stimulating a scale appropriate regenerative economy. Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to look into Brewer Endowed. That's interesting. But I wonder what like how they handle making predictions and then reassessing. Is it something that comes from like information and data that there's like how is their reasoning on that kind of stuff? Um, I guess it's being as optimistic as I am, sometimes I wonder about how these kinds of ideas become self-reinforcing and kind of like doomsday-ish. And that when the doomsday doesn't come, we just kind of push that back. Um, but I mean, I say that, yet we're living in this Anthropocene, and with it, what is likely to become, you know, I mean, I can't say become. We are in the middle of a mass extinction that is driven by human choices and climate change, and we're pushing all of these things. Um, I think about being a kid when my parents and I took a drive out west to visit some family that lived in Illinois, and like making that drive and all the bugs that were there, and coming back and having to scrub everything off. And like now, I'm lucky if I have to clean my windshield from something like that once a year, even though I've been driving so many more miles than ever. Um, and the conversation about fisheries collapses and things like that. And it it feels like there's an imminence to it. But is it 20 years or 50 or 100 before we know that we have fully crossed that cliff? And how much is technology insulating us from the catastrophes that are being felt around the world? Um, yeah, and just some more reading that I have to do myself, understanding that I'm insulated from a lot of that and needing to be aware while also not falling into an existential crisis of everything that's going on and still being in a place to continue to move and act. As from us because it seemed to hinder all these good intentions regarding regeneration. Yeah, your comment, Benny, about money, it's having lived in the gift economy for, the better part of a decade, what we can accomplish with a lot less money if we're in a space to leverage the relationships. I even hate to use the word leverage. I don't like the commodification of language and the way that we're using that to relate to people. Um, I think of a YouTube lecture that I saw with Murray Bookchin a number of years ago, discussing like, the way that we talk about investing in our children and all these other things that just kind of seem inappropriate and kind of dirty when it comes to the way that we relate to other people, when the way that we discuss it is all driven by market forces. And that like using the market to talk about people just isn't, it's not humanizing, it's dehumanizing in many ways. But with that, um, I think about the story of the world that we live in and what we're told that we need and the pressures that we feel to live in a certain way or act in a certain way, and the way that that drives cost and expense and makes it harder and harder to engage in what we want to do, and the amount of creativity that we can use in order to push through a lot of these ideas. But it's like needing to sit down and reflect really heavily on our own personal place and perspective, that zone zero kind of space, to know what our real needs are, know deeply what it is that we have in order to live the way that we want to, need to, however we want to describe that, and then use that then to kind of build up from in order to accomplish a lot of this work. Um, because if we want to work towards regeneration, what does that look like? Like for you, Benny, what does regeneration mean for you or the projects that you're working on? Um, and that's where, like, if each of us can get really clear on those kinds of ideas, what are the things that we can do to have conversations in an open way, almost a vulnerable way, with people who are around us who advocate for much of what we believe in, who are there to work on or work with us on helping us accomplish these things. Um, like with land access issues and things like what Chris Newman is doing in order to help people get access to land. Um, or thinking about people who have gone through and put out Craigslist asking for people for space in their backyard that they can garden in. Um, and like, or if it's not land, is it housing? What about co-housing? If it's about like tools, what tools do we really need? And what are the ways that we can like decouple ourselves from the stories of civilization and what our requirements are? Um, what are the things that we can do in a guerrilla fashion to get things done? Whether that's, foraging for food or, gardening in a particular way, planting along abandoned roadsides, um, or whatever it is that we feel comfortable doing in order to live that life that matters to us. So yeah. Well, Nathan, that's one of the pieces for me is that like I see that there's a crash that is imminent, but what are the ways that we can like slow that decline and make it so that it's like a softer landing and not something that is terribly abrupt? And it's one of the pieces that I'm personally handling right now, living outside of DC. 10 days ago, we had what happened at the Capitol. And it was just a reminder of how fragile a lot of this really seems to be and how it can feel, being within walking distance of that space. And that without, I think, personal transformation, a good group of friends in some kind of like an affinity group around various ideas and things, um, and a network of coalitions, that we're not going to have the ability to slow that or make it softer. And like, as a permaculture practitioner, how can I organize around those ideas? Because what we need to do to grow food is pretty well known. I don't think that growing food and saving seed are as complicated as it seems to be in even the permaculture literature. But what conversations can we have to organize socially and bring people together? Um, mm, mm, yeah. And it's to go back to David Graeber, there's a quote of his, and I don't remember it exactly, um, but about that idea that, the first thing that we can do is live as if we're free. And that's kind of the space that I've been in for a long time, is just kind of doing what it is that we want to do. Um, and being able to like lean into the people around us and have these kinds of conversations. Um, yeah. But it's also though that I like a lot of what we encounter with, um, like government and all these other pieces, kind of, I think, go away if we just live in that manner. But I understand that comes from a place of just kind of being able to do that. Um, which I know that not everybody's afforded. And it's like having these conversations and seeing what you're sharing in chat reminds me of a lot of this. Having been in this seat as the host of the show for so long and having had access to all this information, all these resources, all these people, that like how unique each of our own places and positions are, as we go through this. Let me catch up on our chat. Um, yeah, I can understand that system momentum and creating different habits that, I think about some of the advice that's given to creative folks. It's like, oh, we'll work a day job, and then when you're done that, then go do the things you care about. But if you have if you're already engaged in things that you care about because you have a family and children or close friends you're helping, or, older parents who are sick, or you're helping to take care of other people around you, um, that the time for those kinds of things quickly evaporates. That even to carve out a couple of hours here and there, a lot of the folks who I've seen who do that, the models that they present to us are in some ways, I feel, disingenuous because of the money that they have, a partner who is wealthy, resources that were gifted to them, that when you dig a bit deeper into their personal story, it's not something that's replicable. It's not something that we can follow. Um, and so, what are the ways that those of us who live in those situations and are familiar with what it's like to live in a kind of a crunch can help one another work through? And I think that goes back to this idea of money as well, is like, if we start moving through those kinds of systems, for just those of us who are here on this live stream, it's like, what does everybody here need? And is there anybody just in this little group who's together for this conversation? Is there anything that we can do to help one another directly? Even if we're not, directly involved in a local on the ground community, what are the ways we can reach out and help one another? Um, yeah. And Nathan, I understand that mental health issue side of things because it's something that I don't talk about, but I have some of my own both physical and mental health issues that make it hard to keep connections with people routinely and regularly. I've actually found in many regards that COVID has made staying in touch with people easier because, like, setting up some virtual events has made staying in touch with people who I care about a lot simpler. Um, I'm really not I don't have a comfortable time setting and keeping appointments on my own with people and being able to reach out and be like, "Hey, it's been a long time since we talked to each other. When can we sit down and hang out again?" Are like things that are just no, those are not easy at all. Um, and it's what are the ways that we can leverage the tools of, um, I don't want to say civilization, but like, what are the ways that we can use all the tools and everything else that we have developed as a society in the last, 100 years to make that kind of stuff easier? Um, and I even think about something as simple as just letting people know that they're supported. Um, do, 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 do. And, putting out those calls on Twitter or Instagram. What do you need? What can I do or the community do to help you? Jack, as we're talking about that, I wonder, is all this work that's been happening over the last 10 years for this show, is that enough to start leveraging some of this for good and start having conversations with folks about, like, what do you need? What seeds do you need for your garden this year? Are you in a place where, you're just hungry and I can order you a pizza and have it delivered to your house? You know, can the permaculture podcast community become a mutual aid network? Um, man, you just you've all brought me to a place wondering how I can use what has been built over these years to be more helpful. I don't know. Is any of this stuff that I'm just kind of wandering on about, like, are those some things that any of you would find helpful in the space that you're in? Um, to put out calls like that, or to be able to use the forum of the show or the Patreon community or here on the YouTube channel to be able to put shout outs that, hey, I know somebody in, town X, city Y, um, country Z who's looking for land, and just see what comes up. Um, would it help for me to collect a list of needs and put out a call in my newsletter and let people know, hey, this is the mutual aid message of the month, and say, I need people to put things together. Um, so Well, and that's where I'm wondering, like, between some, like, short-term needs and being able to put a needs call versus something that's, like, bigger for, like, maybe if somebody's wanting to buy property or things like that because of it's also that the community isn't centralized right now. The people who follow the show on Instagram are different from the folks who are on Discord, who are different from the people on the mailing list. Um, but I mean, that's just I express that just as a short-term issue. Um, okay. Yeah, and maybe that's the thing is just because of all of these different networks and the way that I can automate some of this to just pull everything together and throw it out there and see which ones happen to work best for particular community. Um, and just kind of hub it and be able to say, "Hey, if you need anything, here are the ways to get in touch. Here are the different ways that we're going to organize this." Um, but that also, I think, then that the Discord, I should probably make a Patreon specific server channel and then also make a general one for requests and things like that so that I can kind of keep it under in one place. Um, between all the Discord servers that I'm on right now, I have just enough that I can handle. Um, though I guess that's also something that could be put out there as looking for somebody who would be interested in moderating Discord. Even though, yes, I've mostly been sharing about fermentation for the last few weeks because that's what I've been working on. But now we're having these conversations about um, race and appropriation and different practices. Um, yeah, just continuing to kind of funnel people there as an immediate kind of thing. But it also reminds me, I could also get back in touch with Zev Friedman, who was doing the mutual aid group in North Carolina. Um, okay. Yeah, then maybe we should chat a little bit about that also. If you've got some time for a call this evening, Jason, to set up some of that. But yeah, it's just after all these years of like putting the show together, I'm personally in a space where, with wanting to take a break and a sabbatical is like having done the same thing for so long, realizing how much all of this is there that can benefit a lot more than just sharing stories. Like, as valuable as that has been for the last couple of years, um, to get people engaged in permaculture and to think about how big things, um, and to think about how big permaculture is beyond just the land base, that now, there's still tens of thousands of downloads of every show. I haven't purposefully grown the mailing list in a long time, but now since I'm taking a break, I've got a pop-up up there and like that's growing by dozens of subscribers a week now. Um, yeah, and I just think it's kind of a space to leverage this a bit more. Man, using leverage again. Hate that word. Um, yeah. So do. I may have to close Discord. You guys are getting chatty over there too. Do, do, do. Oh, so with everything in the last 45 minutes or so, what are some other things that you would like me to be able to cover either in these live streams, in future articles, or something else? Um, I am not on more than I do not have more than one Discord for the show at the moment. It's that some of the other Discords that I'm engaged in when it comes to storytelling and um, some other lighter social engagements. I have Discord open so that I can share the link earlier, and people are just kind of chatty over there, and I've got messages showing up everywhere. Um, but I'm probably going to keep one Discord for the show, but also divide that out so that I can let folks know that there are some other spaces to engage. And then, as Jason had suggested, probably assign some roles so that Patreon supporters still have their own space for us to engage directly in conversation. Because even though like this live stream today is open to anyone on YouTube who would like to join us, I'm also still doing um, Patreon exclusive live streams twice a month, and then I want to do these public live streams twice a month, um, for us to be able to have conversations and engage, and yeah, be able to just have these what feel like one-sided conversations because I'm the only one talking, but having the chat and everything else that's going on. Um, it's one of the pieces of like taking the break and some time away from the show proper was that the way that I designed the show for many years was to be able to share my guests and connect people to voices that they might not hear otherwise, to expand on the ideas of what permaculture can mean. But now, with all of these ideas and all this information collected, moving into a next phase where we're able to spend more time really engaged in working with this material, being able to take it beyond just the long form interviews, but to engage in more storytelling, in having more space for permaculture practitioners, for Patreon community members to influence the direction of the show by letting me know more about who do you want me to talk to, what are things that you want to follow up on, what are issues that you're currently dealing with that I can help you engage and resolve. Um, so like that's why the Ask Me Anything threads are every month, and your responses to those kind of influence the direction of um, where and how I address some things. The recent um, question from John about like a nursery business. Now I'd like to go back and take what he had shared and my brief response and write that up into something bigger that I can share with you on Patreon directly and quickly as an article to connect you with resources if you're interested in creating a nursery or building, as a business or as a home practice so that you can be propagating your own plants with all the resources and information you would need for that, but then also record a script around that idea and hand that off to my buddy Mike, who was the graphic designer and um, motion graphics guy who put together my piece on racism and land access in America that you'll find on the YouTube channel. So that we can continue to produce pieces like that for YouTube for kind of like just to put it out there and for yeah, download and kind of I don't want to say consumption, but just so people can continue to access additional resources that stem from your interests. Because I love all of this when it comes to permaculture, this big umbrella that we kind of sit under and within as practitioners. There's just so much that we can do. And now, with more than a decade behind me, I kind of want to just move into a different role. But I'm really using your feedback and interest to judge and gauge where things can move from here. Um, as I started this conversation, as some of you were first joining me, um, uh, yeah. Well, and that's I'd like to do some of the Zoom chats for some Q&As and some workshop stuff. But that's still something that I'm putting together. I have a class, which some of you saw in the Discord chat, talking with Weird Child about storytelling for design, based on a conversation. Um, Yeah, no, my like activities usually that I just kind of wander around my apartment with my hands in my pocket, mumbling into a microphone. But that's not as easy as interesting for a Zoom chat. Um, but it could be a way to put together a conversation or just a live discussion in person to do like, yeah, some kind of a Zoom call like that. Of course, we could do it without video, so that way I could just kind of wander around and chat with folks. Um, though we did that, another way to do it would be if someone would want to sit in as a co-host or moderator and kind of bring people in, but that's something else. That's where I kind of like this space is being able to like, yeah, again, just hear back from you of ways that we might, or I might be able to leverage this. And it's just because I also know that so many people who listen to the show have their own voice and their own resources that for so long, because of needing to have voices on the show that help to continue to draw in an audience, um, that it was a bit more like name seeking. And like, now that the show is the size that is, as long as the conversation be kept interesting, that I don't know that I have to do that. Um, Understanding how some of the bigger names are also problematic when it comes to, like, the choices that they've made and what comes out because of being public people with power, um, that, there are just so many amazing people who are experts already that I'd like to have on and be able to talk to. So but hey, Ali, thanks for coming in and joining the conversation. Yeah, as I was saying when we first started this, I'd like to be doing documentaries with people. And there are a lot of folks who I just want to go sit down with and record a conversation, um, and document their project. Go spend a day or two, shoot 4 or 5 hours of video, compile it down to something that's 15 or 20 minutes, easy to share, but that tells their story and shows what they're doing. And so, if there's anybody who you would like to see in something like that, certainly email me. In the COVID world that we're in, do, 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 do. Yeah. If you want to, just go ahead and send me KMO's contact information, and we can see what we can do. There's some folks who I'm in touch with who we're talking, and together we're talking about forming a like regenerative podcasters alliance and doing some work together, sharing content across our different shows, sitting down and doing some round tables. There are a lot of different spaces where like all of this can be done, and we're just finding the ways that we can do that. Um, it's also to work on trying to build some stability for all of us as our own respective shows have grown over the years. This work, if we want to continue to do it and do it well, it becomes more and more of a full-time endeavor. There's just so much that we have to do in order to book guests, record shows, and things like that, that it's um yeah, it's a lot of work for one person, but we still want to be able to do this and continue to share what it is that we're doing. So, but with where I'm at, we've got about 5 minutes left in the stream as scheduled. Is there anything else that anybody would like to raise in the moments that are remaining? Should we? Is this a good time for us to talk about composting toilets, Jason? I guess it's just we're always going to have time to talk about composting toilets if we want to. Um, for those of you who don't know, this is a running joke with Jason and I. Jason is the creator behind The Fifth World and a good friend of mine. Known him for many years. He's one of the reasons why I still do this show. After talking me down from the cliff probably 5 or 6 years ago when I was considering leaving the podcast. Um, Dear friend, and love having him here with us. But in a conversation, I'd put out a call for questions for Jason because I was going to have him on the show, and someone had put in, even though we were going to be talking about storytelling, had asked us about composting toilets. And what I can say is that most of the composting toilets that I've used have been bucket systems. And I found they worked very well. They're really good, easy ways to get started. And yeah, it was just, composting toilets. There are some great books on composting toilets, which this reminds me then, bless, if you um, would like, I can put together an article for more information on where to go for that. There's some people who have some videos and things. But my work with composting toilets is that they're really awesome. Like, there's nothing really weird about them once you start using one. It's pretty pretty simple and straightforward. The hardest problem, though, that I have with them is that in cities, finding a way to compost, um, your products from them. But generally speaking, yeah, they're safe and easy to work with. Um, and that's well, and my thing about from what I've read about like the Humidor Handbook and some other places, um, if you pasteurize it using like a solar pasteurizer, it's totally cool to put on like trees and things like that. The biggest concern that I run into is knowing what we're putting into our composting toilets when it comes to pharmaceuticals because of certain things that are excreted through our urine or through our feces, and needing to make sure that those kinds of things are separated out. Um, just because there's not a good system for keeping some of that out of our gardens. I've also read some interesting research about some of the hormones that we can for like estrogen or testosterone replacement therapies, the impacts that those can have on plants. Um, but yeah, Joe Jenkins' Humidor Handbook is out there and it's completely free. Oddly enough, Joe Jenkins is a slate roofer and someone who it was Holly Brown told me about that. I'd always thought that he was someone who was like that was his big thing, but no, he's a slate roofer, and Holly Brown, her husband, absolutely loves Joe, largely because, like, Holly's husband was a roofer. Um, weird anecdote that comes about from sitting down and talking about these things with people in their own spaces. Um, but it's a fascinating read. Like, the Humidor Handbook is Man, now that I think about it, that's probably in my top 10, like, suggested readings for people for non-permaculture books because of how much information he shares about what we can do to process waste, from human systems. It is so good. The other one that I really recommend is there's, Rodale's I think it's their Encyclopedia of Composting is another one really, really good, but I don't like the modern version of it. I actually prefer one of the earlier printings because, yeah, I'll actually pull the link and drop it in the chat. Give me just a second. Um, I prefer Rodale's. Do, do, do. I like the earlier editions of Rodale's book because they talk about stuff like composting your animal waste. And I think there's some stuff in there about like animal carcasses after you've processed chickens. Um, but yeah, Rodale's earlier editions on composting, which you can get really inexpensive, are pretty awesome. And yeah, Joe's book, if I remember right, I think it's his third edition, is available for free online. That he like keeps the most recent edition is in print, and then the previous is available online. But check it out, really, really worth it. So we've hit 5 o'clock. Any last questions then before I call it an evening and go eat some goulash? All right, folks, I'm gonna call it a night then, and the next Patreon live stream is going to be in 10 days on January 26th. And then I'll be doing another um, public live stream for everybody on the 30th. The one on the 26th will be at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And then the one on the 30th will again be at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. No sides for goulash. We make it like a heavy stew and put carrots and potatoes in it. It is a complete meal by itself with a couple of pounds of mushrooms and other goodies. And absolutely one of our favorite meals. So, but yeah, take care, everybody. Have a good night, and I'll catch you again soon.